We've now reached the perception functions. Now, as you can see here, almost all of the signals in the perception functions have a direct comparison to their opposite. So what I'll be doing is comparing two of them at a time, beginning here first with SI versus NI. So for all four perception functions, the first signal, which is SI1, NI1, NE1, and SE1, are all connected to each other in describing an inverse relationship between the ocular tension of the orbicularis oculi. So in a nutshell, the pretarsal region is more or less the eyelid itself, which covers the eyeball. The preceptal region is the area around the eye but underneath the eyebrow. So above the eye but beneath the eyebrow, this area here. And then the orbital area goes into and around the eyebrow all the way to the furthest edges. So in SI types, we see that the pretarsal area, that is to say the eyelid, is raised off of the eye. So here we see a very generous display of the eye itself. The eyelid is lifted up off the eye. However, the preceptal area is itself falling down. So, for example, what happens, we see it more clearly here, is that the preceptal area is falling down so much over the eye that it's actually swallowing the eyelid itself. So we can't see the eyelid here, and this is not because of anatomy. This is actually because the preceptal region lacks so much tension that it's falling down over the eye, despite the fact that the eyelid itself is raised off of the eye. Now, we see the complete opposite of this in the eyes of NI. In the eyes of NI, the pretarsal region, which is to say the eyelid, is the one that is falling over the eye. So there's a very hooded aspect to the pupil. As you can see here, the pupil is almost half covered here because the eyelid is falling down over it. However, the preceptal area is the one that is actually raised off of the eyeball itself. And as you can see, I have a young face demonstrating this and an old face just to show the contrast and how it is the same regardless of age. So here we see that the pretarsal region, or the eyelid, is falling down over the eye, covering parts of the pupil, but the preceptal area is raised off of the eye in the same way that it is in here. And the inversion of the tension of these two components is what creates the difference between SI tension and NI tension. These are the most important aspects of the difference between the eyes. What we're going to go into next are the brow, but the brow plays a more secondary role. So SI2 is slanting outer edges, the outer edges of the eyebrow. So as you can see here, the eyebrow, which relates more to the orbital area, is falling down in this diagonal direction out towards the ear area. You can see here as well that it's falling down, going towards the ear, basically sagging or slanting. Oppositely, here we see NI2, which is raised outer edges. So the opposite is happening here, where the eyebrow is by default lifted off of the eye because the orbital area is also raised. However, I have to make several distinctions here because, number one, this is not the same as a brow raise. A brow raise is when the person deliberately lifts the eyebrows off as a sort of accentuation. The point of this signal, and what defines NI2's raised outer edges, is that there's a baseline continuous level of elevation because the orbital region of the eye has a continuous tautness to it. SI3 is concerned scowling. Right here, what we're looking at is this center area between the eyes here as well, and the way that there's a scrunching happening. Now, the best way to describe this is by looking at the opposite, which is NI3, which is intense scowling. Now notice the quality is very different between this scowl and this scowl. These scowls usually have nothing going on here in this edge or this edge. These are relatively normal. The concentration of activity is just here in the middle. Notice the intensity caused by parts of the frontalis being raised over here and here at the same time as the scowl is going down, but also colliding with the tension of the orbicularis oculi. So what is happening here is that the orbicularis oculi is taut all the way up to the orbital region at the same time as the frontalis is clashing down from the top, which creates an abundance of collisions. All this variety here is due to the tension of the clashing. And we don't see that here. What we basically see is just in the center area. That's where the concentration is at. And that's how we can differentiate out the SI scowls from the NI's intense scowls. Now we have the confused stare. This one is defined here as the area between the eyes is elevated up as the person stares forward in a fixed gaze. So there's two elements here. The area between the eyes is lifted while the person, you see his eyes here, look at the pupils, they drift off to the sides. And that's the fixed gaze happening while there's an elevation of the center of the brow area. We see it here also in a younger face, this elevation of the center of the brow. The way that this brow elevates has a bit of a curvature happening. There's almost like a U shape to the brow as it lifts up right at the center. The signal adjacent to this one is NI4, which is zoned out stare. And this says the pupils remain completely unmoving and unchanging as the person zones out, staring at some irrelevant point in the environment. So notice here, Garrison Keillor, the eyes are zoned out at some invisible point while not moving in the slightest. Despite the fact that his head is moving, the eyes are not changing at all in their direction. Here we see in Ray Kurzweil the same thing. The eyes seem to be zoned out somewhere, so that even though it might seem as though they're looking at you when they're talking, they're actually not looking at you, they're looking past you or beyond you or at some other point. But what's actually happening is they're looking internally. The perception is drifting through their own inner worldview. Now, I chose to include this somewhat ambiguous sample of Ray Kurzweil in this because of something that needs to be mentioned, and that is that sometimes there is a raise of the eyebrow, as is here, and yes, the middle of the eyebrow is lifted off, but actually the whole eyebrow is lifted off of the eyes here. This is a little different from here, where what's happening is the center of the brow is what is mostly lifting. So there's a difference here between how the outer edges remain lowered in comparison to the center. So there's a slant going up, and as I said, sometimes it even curves into a U shape in the center. The fact of just lifting the whole brow uniformly off the eyes is not an indication of SI. A lot of NI users can do that, as Ray Kurzweil is doing here, and you can especially still tell that it's NI because the eyes, once again, remain hypnotic with the upper eyelid lowered over the eye and covering half the pupil. Also, the preceptal area, as you can see here, remains taut. So this hypnotic eye activity is happening in Ray Kurzweil, and the whole eyebrow is lifted off. It's not doing an SI stare. It's a subtle difference, but I wanted to include it in here just because this can trip a lot of people up, and we might as well talk about it now. Okay, that completes all the major beats of the eye tension. Now we're going to look at other parts of the perception functions relating to more macro gestures, such as the body. NI5 is far away diagonal drifts. So this is an example of the PI3 diagonal eye drifts, but in conjunction with NI's ocular tension. So that zoned out stare that we talked about before is happening here alongside the diagonal eye drifts, so that the zone out happens off to a diagonal corner. We can see it here too, with that same zoned out expression. And the opposite's true of SI5. The concerned diagonal drifts happen when there is either a confused stare or a concerned scowl, or both. So we're looking at the conjunction of the diagonal eye drifts with the qualities of SI or with the qualities of NI as described in the above signals. Next pair of signals are SI6, anecdotal rambling, and NI6, abstract rambling. We read here, the person elaborates about a series of connected anecdotes in a long and unbroken chain with continuity between them. These are often tied together chronologically or categorically rather than strictly causally.
My father was a geochemist, and he was asked shortly after the end of the war to be visiting professor in Chicago. So I just finished my high school, whatever you would call it, and I went along with him. So I got into the University of Chicago and started with paleontology and anthropology, thinking about human evolution.
1956 to 1957 in a course at Harvard where Modern Man in Search of His Soul was assigned. And that was rare enough in those days to have a university teaching Jung. But Henry Murray was the co-professor of that course. The other was an anthropologist named Clyde Kluckhohn.
So as we saw, they narrate through a series of anecdotes, usually with a chronology to them, or a categorical similarity, and it's not necessarily the discussion of a cause and event sequence, as it is a continuous unbroken chain of associated points of data. And the way that these contents emerge is different from SI and NI. So in NI, we see that the person elaborates about a series of correlated abstract concepts in a long and unbroken chain with continuity between them. But these are often tied together phenomenologically or synchronistically rather than strictly causally.
Understood that there are really three levels of reality that are created by three different levels of consciousness. The highest realm, you can't even speak of consciousness, you cannot say anything about it. I call it just It is beyond words and before verbal explication.
So what we saw is that the NI users also drift across and between different information bits, but the datasets that they choose to correlate together are not correlated chronologically or categorically. They are correlated phenomenologically and synchronistically. And just one aspect of this that can emerge, not necessarily that can emerge, is a kind of inclination towards esoteric discussion that relates more to the similarity of the general shape of the idea, because the thoughts of NI are related to associated abstract ideas. With SI, it's often a relay of certain concrete anecdotes and happenstances, or even if it's not things that have happened to them anecdotally, it's information bits, data sets, like, I don't know, the size of a Tyrannosaurus. Those are the kind of categorical concrete information bits that are relayed when SI does its rambling. Next, we take a look at the inertial energy differences between the two PI functions, beginning with Ni7, which is grounded inertia. As we discussed before, PI1 is the inertial energy, which creates a sort of seatedness of the body. Things tend to go towards a stillness, but not because of rigidity, simply because of the absence of momentum. And this inertia is the heaviest in Ni, because Ni also does not have the levity of Ni, which we'll get to later. But because Ni is correlated with Se, the rootedness in the present is the strongest here. So what you'll see is that the body and spine sink down lethargically. The torso remains immobilized, even though the head and limbs may animate. His entire body is lethargically inanimate, even though he is doing a glance to the side and then doing a forward stare. And then you can see the slight faint animations of the head, such as when he looks over here and then there and back. But overall, the body is sunken, it's heavy, and it's falling to the ground. Now, this is not necessarily the case with SI. As we see in SI7, what we see is lightweight inertia. Now, again, this relates to the fact that SI is paired with NE, and SI has a little of that buoyant undercurrent, which we'll get to later, embedded within it at all times, which makes it unlikely for SI to ever completely sink into the ground. There's always going to be a little bit of a perk, a little bit of a shift, because of the levity provided by NE. So here we see an example of that. Notice how there is still a rootedness, a lethargic quality, an inertial quality, so the movements are not in any rush, spunk up, and yet there is that playful buoyancy. There's this playful pendulum effect to the torso, which is very, very subtle. So here he is doing a forward fixed gaze, a PI fixed gaze, but notice the subtle wobbling of the shoulders here. It's the same as what happens with him here. This just demonstrates the fact that there's still a level of continuity in the SI user. And the reason this signal matters is because without understanding the fact that SI, even in its most inertial, still has a little bit of levity, there may be a mistyping of this and misinterpreting them for another kind of PE lead. Now we move on to SI8, which is indented eye sockets. The eyes sink deeply into the eye sockets. So here's the eye, and they're indented into the socket, covered by the muscular tension formed from the brow ridge and slanting outer edges. So the combination of the brow and this too, remember we talked about the preceptal region, the brow, and the slanting edges all form this heaviness that acts kind of like a cave in which the eye falls. And this is describing the effects of muscular tension over a lot of years. It's not necessarily an anatomical feature. And SI9 is dancing brow. The brow contracts in a wave-like pattern, first at the outer brow edges, and then curling in towards the middle of the eyes. As you can see here, the eyebrow goes into a U shape. Remember we talked about the U shape. So it races off the eyes, and then starting from the outer edges, it slants and it curves up. So it goes this way, whoop, in that wave-like pattern. You can see it here. It's more subtle in this GIF, but it starts at the outer edges and it curves inward this way. So this is a more explicit example of what we saw in the confused stare, but this is not itself the stare. This is just the brow doing this curvature. And the last SI signal is SI10, which is cautious skepticism, which says that there is a caution against newly introduced structures, often highlighting their danger and utilizing facts and scientific data as validation for skepticism of their validity, utility, and truth. So what this means is that SI is oriented towards certainty in the form of facts. So facts are not the same thing as what SE perceives. SE perceives the present moment in a very literal, vivid realism. But facts are somewhat abstracted. So it's a concrete data that has been abstracted from reality, and now the data itself is treated as real. I've sometimes called this trivia. So trivia information is a form of facts. So SI relies on this factual data to so SI is so these last two signals, SI10 and NI10, refer to the paranoid aspects of both of these functions. And in SI, its wariness and temperance towards reality is directed towards the gaps in facts about anything. So if there's a gap in the facts, SI remains cautious. And all things being equal, it will default back to the last place that the facts are known.
There's much more to this situation that we need to understand. You know, Clarence Thomas and Stephen Breyer, the most liberal, most conservative justice, dissented. Stephen Breyer said they use these to train military. I'm not a medical expert, but I know who is, and it's not the people the video game industry put out. When I was a kid, nobody buckled their seatbelt. We're all just fine. Not everybody their seatbelt unbuckled died, but all the ones that died had the...
But I took it to heart and I began to research. And then when I got more into it, I looked at the Enneagram and how the people there were involved in the occult. I looked at Carl Jung, and he was deeply involved in the occult. I don't know if I could say that there was a man more involved in the occult at his time of living than Carl Jung. And that was the nail in the coffin. And I said, you know, this stuff is wrong. It taints people, it corrupts people, and it's not even scientifically accurate now that I know the true origins. And that was the nail in the coffin for me.
So as we saw in both of these samples, there's a level of admitted ignorance. They don't know everything, but they do know a few things. And the things that they do know would tell them that there's something to steer away from. There's something to not go towards. And that is essentially how SI's cautious skepticism operates. And the signal that stands in contrast to SI's cautious skepticism is NI's visionary fatalism, where, as it says here, a prognosis of the future appears bleak, due to a sense of nigh inevitable catastrophe.
And it looks to me like things could go extraordinarily well if we were careful, but I'm not optimistic. And maybe that's me. I'm pessimistic because I also see that there's 5 or 6 things happening, all of which appear at the level of catastrophe, that are all happening at the same time.
I try to convince people to slow down AI, to regulate AI. This was futile. I tried for years.
This seems
Nobody
like a scene
listened.
in a movie
Nobody
where
listened.
the robots are going to fucking take over and you're freaking me out. Nobody listened.
Nobody listened.
No.
So notice the difference here. There's a bleak outlook on the future because, again, this is an aspect of PI's paranoia manifesting in NI. There's something that's imminent, that's going to happen, catastrophic, due to the way things are headed now. Now, because NI is an anticipatory process, what it tracks is a bit of a premonition. It tracks a bit of an ominous sense to things, and it uses that as its point of caution. So both SI and NI have caution and paranoia, but it's for different things, as we saw in both of these videos. Now, I actually skipped over these 2 NI signals, so I'm just going to go over them really quickly. NI8 is Unblinking Eyes, and this just refers to the fact that the NI eyes tend to remain unblinking for very long periods of time, which is part of the zoned out stare. So in the zoned out stare, what you're looking for is how the eyes seem to be tuned out to some faraway distant point of focus. They lose contact with reality, so the eyes just kind of stay glaring at that area. But in addition, you might also see the fact that the eyes may refuse to blink during the whole duration. So this could be 5 seconds, maybe even 10 seconds of an undisturbed, zoned out pair of eyes. And lastly, NI9 is Esoteric Se Channeling. So this is another audible signal, and it's a bit of a psychological signal. What happens is that Se's presence is mythologized as a gateway to spiritual enlightenment and the truth of reality.
Then is not to understand more or to bring some intellectual analysis to the practice, but to practice the state of not thinking, which can be arrived at by various ways, as you probably know. If you don't think about it, just do it. Becoming more aware of the present moment and accept it as it is slows down the overactive mind, is one thing.
What happens in the NI user is, due to its polar relationship to SE in the unconscious is mythologized, and thus it appears to the mind of the NI user as a kind of mythical truth, some enlightened state of being. So it has a muse relationship to SE. And all these together are the signals of NI.